Mystery of the Caribbean Pearls by Andy Adams. Read by Peter Thomlinson. Chapter 14. A Talk with Crunch. Although Biff's strategy had backfired, it did give his uncle a slight jump on diets. Just after daybreak, Charlie Keene and Derek were at the waterport where Keene kept his seaplane. He warmed up the plane's twin engines. He pointed the plane's nose into the wind, and the aircraft streaked across mirror-flat water. The seal between the plane's hull and the sea was broken, and the plane was airborne. Charlie Keene put the plane on a course direct for Martinique, a little over 500 miles away. If all went well, they would land at Fort de France in under 3 hours. That would get them there in time for the opening of the office of the Fisheries Commission. Dietz wouldn't be able to leave until the commercial flight at 9 a.m. He wouldn't get to Martinique until noon. "I hope Biff's all right," Derek said to Biff's uncle. The plane was high over the sparkling waters of the Caribbean Sea. The island of Curaçao was only a small dot in the sea behind them. Directly below they saw a slender cigar-shaped cruise ship heading for the port Charlie Keene and Derek had just left. "Biff's been in plenty of tough spots, Derek. I've been in some of them with him. I'd have never let him take that chance if I didn't think he could handle it. Still, I won't have any peace of mind until we're all together again." "That would be good, Mr. Keene. It seems I only see Biff for a few minutes. Then we're separated again. I like Biff. I want to know him better." Uncle Charlie smiled. It pleased him that his nephew and Derek had become friends. "You will, Derek, and you're right. Biff's as fine a fellow as you'll ever know. You two ought to have a great time, skin diving for pearls. You ever do any skin diving?" "Some, in the Mediterranean. I went there with my grandparents last summer. Biff's done a lot of skin diving, I'll wager." "He sure has, Derek. In Hawaii and off the coast of Southern California. His family has a cottage on the lake out there. The whole family goes in for the sport." A little after 8:30, the island of Martinique came into view. "Another 10 minutes and we'll be there," Charlie said. He put the plane into a long, gentle descent. They came in low over Fort de France, circled the city, then came back to set down in the harbour. At about the same time Charles Keene was setting the seaplane down, Crunch was setting Biff's breakfast before him. While Crunch had been at the big house to pick up the food, Biff had inspected the prison carefully. It didn't take him long to determine that escape was out of the question. The iron bars on the windows were 3/4 of an inch thick and deeply embedded in the concrete. Biff tested each bar just in case there might be a loose one. "Not a chance," Biff thought. "I'm here until somebody comes for me. Unless I can outfox Crunch again." Now, Biff and Crunch ate their breakfast in silence. When they had finished, Biff tried to draw the giant out. His first questions were met with grunted replies. "You know, Crunch," Biff said again, "I've been all over the world, and I don't think I've ever seen a man as big and strong as you are." A pleased smile came over the Indian's face. He still didn't say anything. "In China, I knew a man called Muscles. I thought he was strong, but you could handle him easily." The pleased smile on Crunch's simple face grew broader. "I suppose your boss, Dietz, has already gone?" Biff shot the question in while Crunch was still enjoying the flattery. Crunch froze. The pleased expression left his face. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to. I know he's gone. I heard the car leave early this morning." "You hear car leave, you know boss gone. Why you ask?" Crunch demanded. "Just something to talk about, Crunch," Biff said casually. "We're going to get mighty tired of one another just sitting here in silence." The Indian didn't reply. "You know, Crunch, I think I could get to like you. You don't look like a bad man to me." "Crunch good man," the Indian said. "Then why do you work for Dietz?" Biff asked. No reply. "Oh, you don't have to tell me, but I know we could be friends. I'm not going to try to get away from you." "You do one time, make fool out of Crunch. Boss Dietz very mad at Crunch." "You're not going to believe this, Crunch, but I never did escape from you, honestly." "Now you make joke with Crunch. You get away, last night, before sky get dark." "How could I, Crunch?" Biff asked. "Have you looked around the windows? The bars are still all in them, aren't they? Crunch, look good. Bars all there. You get out by magic. Biff laughed. Well, I must admit, I did use a trick. See, Crunch, no. You get out by magic. If I got out by magic once, why couldn't I do it again, like right now? Biff stood up. Crunch leapt to his feet and grabbed Biff by the arm. You go, Crunch, go with you, he declared. That's too much of a trick for me, Biff said, laughing, even if you do think I'm magic. Crunch released his grasp. Biff sat down, rubbing his arm where the giant had grabbed it. Do you like Dietz, Crunch? Do you like working for him? Crunch frowned. He looked like a big bad boy forced to do something he didn't want to do. I'd say you don't, Biff went on. I can't believe a man like you would work for a bad man like Dietz if you didn't have to. Have to, Crunch said. His hand flew to his mouth as if he were trying to force back the words he had just spoken. I thought so, Crunch, Biff said. He was winning this man over. Biff felt a definite sympathy for Crunch. Why do you work for him? Crunch was silent for a minute. When he finally spoke, there was a surprising bitterness in his voice. Crunch have brother, little brother. He do bad thing one time. Have to leave Curatio. He go to Martinique. Lots of Carib Indians still in Martinique. Crunch stopped speaking. This was the longest statement he had made. It seemed to pain him to talk so much. Go on, Crunch, Biff said gently. In Martinique, brother work for Boss Dietz. He tell Boss Dietz what he do. He hope to come back to Curatio. Boss Dietz says he help. Crunch paused again. And he didn't. No, he come to Crunch. Say if Crunch don't work for him, do everything he say, he tell police. If police catch little brother, him go away to jailhouse for a long time. So that's why you work for Dietz. Crunch nodded his head. Crunch go back to house now. You stay here. No use magic to get out of jail. I promise, Crunch, Biff said. I promise not to use magic. Biff felt so sorry for the giant at that moment. He wouldn't have walked out on him had Crunch left the door wide open. Crunch didn't, however. He made sure the door was locked. In Martinique, Charlie Keene and Derek were coming out of the Fisheries Commissioner's office. They had the papers. The working permit had been signed, and it was now tucked in Derek's inside coat pocket. I never heard so many questions, Mr. Keene, Derek said. That man asked the same ones over and over again. He was stalling, Derek. He didn't want to give us that permit, Biff's uncle said. Why? I don't trust that clerk. I have a feeling he may be dealing with Dietz. Just how, I haven't figured out yet, but I'll bet Dietz promised to cut him in if he could hold up giving us the papers. Well, he did give them to us, Derek remarked. After a struggle. Come on, Derek, let's get back to the plane and hop over to La Trinité. That's where my father had his headquarters, isn't it? Yes, that's where I last saw him, and that was the postmark on the letters and the packaged pearls he sent us. Charles and Derek took a battered taxi driven by a barefoot native back to the airport. The water basin where Charlie's plane was tied up to a long ramp adjoined the airport. They got there just about noon. They saw a commercial plane coming in for a landing. That's the plane from Curatio, Derek. They watched the plane taxi in. They had to pass right by it on their way to the seaplane. The door of the plane opened as they went by. Passengers began deplaning. Derek looked back at them. He grabbed Biff's uncle by the arm. Charles Keene swung round in time to see Dietz and Specs come down the unloading stairs. Come on, don't let them see us. Keene took Derek by the arm and hustled him away. This calls for a change in plans, Biff's uncle said. Something must have gone wrong. I'm really worried about Biff now. I'll fly you over to La Trinité, then get back to Curatio. You'd better lie low. Dietz will be heading for La Trinité as soon as he learns that we beat him to the punch again. When will you come back? Derek asked. As soon as I can. As soon as I can free Biff. Don't let Dietz get his hands on you while I'm gone. I won't, Derek declared. I'm going to spend the time until you and Biff return looking for my father. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. Almost Away. Charles Keene was winging his way back to Curatio. Derek Zook was in La Trinité across the island of Martinique from Fort de France. Biff Brewster was still a prisoner in the cell house outside Wilmenstad. Herman Dietz and Specs Cade were at the Fisheries Commission office in Fort de France, giving a cowering clerk a very hard time. A tall, gaunt man, his body wasted away by a long siege of fever, lay on a narrow cot in a monastery high in the Pitons du Cabet. The time was approaching when all these people would be drawn closer and closer together, the magnet attracting them being a small but rich pearl fishery in the Baie de Trésor. When Charlie dropped Derek off at La Trinité, he had one suggestion as to where the Dutch lad could best start his search for his father. The post office, Derek, Charles Keene had said. That would be your best bet. Your letter and mine both bore the La Trinité postmark. See what you can find out there. Derek was now following Charles Keene's advice. A tall man, you say, very fair with light brown hair, the postal clerk asked. Yes, my father, Derek said. I know he was here about 3 months ago, perhaps a little longer than that. The postal clerk thought for a moment. There was such a man as you describe. I recall him. His appearance was in such contrast to the rest of us here in Trinité. But I have not seen him for months. I know. I haven't heard from him either. I'm desperately anxious for any hint as to where he might have gone. Zook, that was his name, wasn't it? Yes, Derek replied eagerly. Again, the name I remember because it is so different from the names of the people who live here. Yes, many of us knew about this man. He was searching the waters of our treasure bay. That was my father, all right. It was rumoured that he searched for pearls, the clerk went on. The people of this village had great interest in his activities. Would there be any one person who might have known him well? When he was not out searching the ocean floor, he stayed at a small pension not far from here. You could inquire there. Where is the place? It is called by the name of Pension Sans Souci. You will have no trouble in finding it. It is on this very street. When you go out, turn to your right. A walk of 2 blocks will bring you there. Merci, thank you very much, Derek said. His hopes were high as he walked down the street under a blazing tropical sun, but these high hopes were short-lived. At the Sans Souci, the boarding house whose English name would be Without Care, Derek learned little more. I'm so sorry, young man, that I cannot give you any news of your father, the manager of the small boarding house told Derek. We were very fond of him. He left no word as to where he was going? No, we didn't even know he had left us. One morning, quite early, he came to our modest establishment. I thought he seemed quite distraught. He was not his usual cheerful self. He had hardly a word with me, and it was his custom to chat with others here. He went to his room, to rest, I supposed. I went to awaken him for the noon meal. His room was empty. And that is all you can tell me. As much as I regret it, that is all I know. There have been rumours. What? What are they? Derek wanted any information that might be a clue to his father's whereabouts. It was reported shortly after father left us that such a man of his appearance had been seen in the foothills of the Cabet Mountains. But these tales were discounted. It would be highly unlikely that your father would explore the mountains. His interest was in the ocean and what might be at the bottom of the sea. I am sorry, young man. Derek left the Sans Souci very disheartened. If the rumours were true, why would his father have gone into the interior of the island? And if he had gone there, why had he stayed so long? I'm going to find out, Derek said to himself determinedly. Every chance I get. I'll go to those foothills and peaks. I'll find him. In Fort de France, Herman Dietz could hardly contain his anger. Specs had never seen the boss so furious. But it could not have been, Dietz said angrily. He and Specs were in the Fisheries Commission office. The clerk they were talking to cringed at Dietz's words. You're a fool, Dietz raged. I tell you, Derek Zook couldn't have signed for those papers. Derek Zook is in Curatio, right this minute. The clerk could only shake his head. You remember what I promised you, Dietz continued. I told you would share in the proceeds of the pearl fishery. There was little that you had to do, only hold up those rights until I could act. "I tried, Mr. Dietz. I delayed as long as I could. Keene and the boy were here over 2 hours. I expected you here to lodge a protest, but when you failed to appear, I had to issue the permit." "Well, I'm going to lodge a protest now, with the Commissioner himself. I'll tell him how badly you botched your job, how you permitted an impostor to fool you." Dietz stormed out of the office, followed by Specs, and made for the office of the Commissioner. "Another day is coming to an end, Crunch," Biff said to the giant Carib. I'm getting hungry. How about my moving the alarm clock up half an hour?" "Crunch hungry too. Here." Crunch handed Biff the alarm clock. Biff moved the alarm, setting it back from 6:30 to 6. "There, we'll have dinner half an hour earlier." During the long day, Biff had made great progress in gaining Crunch's confidence and friendship. He had drawn the simple-minded giant out about his brother. The crime the brother had committed was a petty crime, a small theft. Biff felt almost certain that the police had long since wiped the charge from the books. Even if they hadn't, the theft had taken place so long ago that Biff thought the statute of limitation would have erased the charge. Dietz, of course, had blown up the seriousness of the theft into a major crime. He had put a real fear into Crunch and his brother. The brother had paid a high price for his deed. Forced to hide out in Martinique, he had been separated from his wife and children for years. "Little brother very much want to come back to Curaçao, want to see family." "Too bad, Crunch," Biff sympathized. "I can imagine how he feels. Does he write? How often do you hear from him?" "No write letters. Can't write. Friends tell about him. Friends who come to Curaçao from Ireland." "From Martinique?" "That's right, from Martinique Island, many, many boat days away." "You know, Crunch, I wouldn't be surprised if I could help your brother come back to Curaçao. He might have to go to jail, but only for a short time. I don't know about that. If he did commit the crime, he'd have to pay for it. But wouldn't it be better if he faced the charge? His sentence would be light. At the end, he would be free." Crunch leaned forward to Biff. Big and powerful as the man was, he had the feelings of a small child. Biff could see tears in his eyes. "You do that? Crunch, your friend." "I can't promise, Crunch, but I do know that Dietz has been using you. Misusing is a better word." Biff wasn't sure Crunch understood. He couldn't be sure, but he felt that he was getting to the giant Indian. At first, it had been Biff's plan to gain Crunch's confidence, outwit him and escape. He still wanted to escape, but by now he felt a great sympathy for the simple, friendly man. He really wanted to help him. The alarm bell went off. Crunch stood up. "No magic. You still be here when Crunch come back?" "I'll be here, Crunch," Biff replied. Crunch went out, still careful to lock the door behind him. There could be no doubt that his liking for Biff was growing, but fear of Dietz still guided the Indian's actions. Crunch had been gone about 5 minutes. Biff stretched out on the cot and turned to his left side. "Ouch," he said as the pen, clipped to his shirt pocket, dug into him. He changed the pen to his hip pocket and settled, face down, relaxed. Suddenly he sat up again, took out the pen and stared at it thoughtfully. Minutes later, Biff was startled by a call from a voice that was good news to Biff. "Biff, Biff, where are you? Sing out so I can come to you." "Here, Uncle Charlie, I'm here, in this house. It's the one farthest from the big house." "I'm on my way, Biff." Biff leapt to the door. He stood there, hands grasping the bars, straining his eyes to spot his uncle. He saw him coming at a run. "Hi, Uncle Charlie," Biff called. "I knew you'd be back for me." He could see the big grin on Charlie's face as he drew nearer. Biff's smile of happiness changed to one of dismay. His uncle was only a few feet away. From behind a clump of bushes, Crunch appeared. He leapt out as Charlie passed, his huge arms wrapped round Keene. "Look out!" Biff cried. It was too late. Charles Keene, a powerful man himself, was helpless in the giant Indian's grasp. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. A Magic Alarm. Biff watched his uncle struggle to break free of the Indian's crushing grasp. He saw the tendons in his uncle's neck grow taut and stand out as Charlie Keene heaved his shoulders with every bit of his strength. It was as if his uncle were trying to break loose from iron bands. "Crunch! Crunch!" Biff shouted. "Let him go! Let him go!" The Indian only shook his head. Biff strained at the iron bars, furious that he was unable to go to his uncle's aid. "I'm your friend, Crunch," So is that man. He's my uncle. Let him go." Crunch ignored Biff. Charlie's face was turning red. The powerful Crunch was actually trying to crush his smaller opponent. Biff knew he had to do something, and do it fast. But what? Biff realized that if he were to keep his uncle from having some ribs cracked, it would have to be brains against brawn. Maybe Biff could play on the Indian superstition. "Crunch!" he shouted again. "If you don't let him go, I'll make more magic. Bad magic." At first the words had no effect on Crunch, but after a few moments Biff's threat seemed to sink in. Crunch released some of his pressure, but still held Charlie Keene firmly. "If you don't let him go, I'll make the magic that takes me out of this house," Biff threatened. Crunch was listening now. "I'll disappear, Crunch. Watch." Biff moved away from the doorway. He went to the window to the right of the door. He stayed below the opening so Crunch couldn't see him. "Where am I, Crunch?" Biff called out. "You think I'm at this window, don't you? You hear my voice at this window. But I'm not here. Only my voice is. My body is at the other window." Biff leapt across the small room at his last word and sprang into view at the window to the left of the door. As he looked out, Crunch was still watching the other window. Biff banged the bars of the window, being careful not to speak. Crunch swung his head around. The sight of Biff startled him. Biff ducked down. He cupped his hands and held them to his mouth. Turning his head in the direction of the other window, he called in a low voice, "But my voice is still where you first heard it." Biff raised his head slowly. The simple trick was working. Crunch had turned to the other window. "Now my voice and body are back together again, Crunch." The startled expression on Crunch's face showed the giant Indian's confusion. He was becoming frightened. If only I had a clincher, Biff thought. Something that would really impress Crunch. Biff's eyes lit on the alarm clock. An idea popped into his head. "I'm going to disappear, Crunch," he called, "but I'll return. And if I return, you will have to release that man." Biff ducked down. He grabbed the alarm clock and raced into the back room, careful to keep out of sight. Biff was counting on the Indians actually believing he had disappeared to get enough time to put his new idea into effect. Quickly, Biff reset the alarm. He set it to go off in 3 minutes. He put the alarm lever at on. Then he went to a side window and tossed the alarm clock out. He saw it land in the soft sand and prayed the fall hadn't damaged the clock. Biff hurried back to the front room. He got down on his hands and knees and crawled to the door. It was a huge door. The bottom half was of heavy, thick timbers. The upper half was open with 5-inch thick iron bars. Slowly, Biff raised his head until it was just above the solid half of the door. From the outside, his head looked as if it were detached from his body. "Crunch!" Biff said the name softly. Crunch, fright showing in his eyes, looked from one window to the other. "Crunch!" Biff called softly again. "I'm down here now. My head is." Crunch looked at the door. His eyes widened, showing white. Crunch was becoming terrified. "I give you a minute, Crunch. Just 1 minute. Then, if you don't release my uncle, evil spirits will surround you and this house. They will ring bells." I hope," Biff said to himself. Crunch still held on to Charles Keene, but his grip was nowhere near as strong as it had been. Biff waited. In his anxiety, his palms were sweating. "Crunch," Biff said again, "I've warned you. Let him go." At these words, the alarm clock went off. "Enough!" Crunch yelled. He let go of Charlie, turned and fled. Charles Keene shook himself. He pressed his ribs with his hands. "No bones broken, but wow, is that guy ever strong?" "He could have crushed me, Biff. That was sure quick thinking on your part." Charlie walked over to the door. "If I'd known how powerful that man is," he added, "I never would have let you get yourself captured." Biff smiled. "Crunch isn't as bad as he seems, Uncle Charlie. He's really a very gentle man." "Gentle? You've never been given a Crunch bear hug." "I mean, he's a simple soul. He's superstitious. He really thinks I can magic myself out of this place. He thinks that's how Derek got out the first time. He doesn't know, of course, that it was I, not Derek, he saw outside. And speaking of getting outside, just how are we going to get you out of this place? Uncle Charlie demanded. Crunch has the key, Biff said, and you've scared him so badly he'll never come back. Let me take a look at this lock. Charlie examined the lock carefully. It's no good, Biff. It's too strong to force. I can't open this lock. You're just going to have to magic your way out. Or get Crunch to come back and let me out. Think you can, Biff? I doubt it. I can try, Biff replied. Crunch and I were getting to be good friends. He's not a bad guy. Dietz has a hold on him and forces him to do his dirty work. I'm going to call him. Crunch, Biff sang out. No answer. Crunch, can you hear me? If you can, listen carefully. I've sent the evil spirits away. They won't harm you. They have stopped their noises. The alarm clock had run down. I'm still locked in, Crunch. I promised you I wouldn't use my magic to get out. I've kept my promise. Come back and see. If this works, Biff, Uncle Charlie said in a low voice, then you've really got that giant under your thumb. Biff and his uncle waited. No sign of Crunch, no sound. It'll be night soon, Biff. He'll never come back in the dark. I know that. I'm going to try again. Crunch! Night is coming on. My magic works better in the dark. If you don't come back before it's dark, then I'll have to break my promise and magic my way out. That ought to do it if anything will, Biff, Charlie said. They waited. Both looked toward the east. Already the horizon was beginning to darken. Minutes passed. It would be totally dark in another minute. Crunch, come back, the deep voice came from the shadows. Charlie Keene swung round. 10 feet away, at the edge of the sand apron, extending from the undergrowth to the house, stood Crunch. Let me do the talking, Uncle Charlie, Biff said in a low voice. You bet I will, Biff. You know how to handle that giant. Come here, Crunch, Biff said gently. The Indian approached cautiously. His head pivoted from one direction to the other. Crunch was looking for the evil spirits. I have kept my promise, Crunch. I have not made the magic that would take me out of here. Crunch didn't speak. I want you to let this man in here with me. I want to show you that we are your friends. Crunch was at the door. His hand pulled out the large key to the lock. Uncle Charlie, Crunch is going to let you come in with me. Then he will go back to the house for food for all of us. But Biff, Charlie protested, if I get locked in there with you. It'll be all right, Uncle Charlie. Crunch is our friend. We are his friends. Please let me handle this my way. Charles Keene shrugged his shoulders. Okay, Biff. Crunch turned the key in the lock. He swung the door open. Charlie Keene entered, and Crunch closed and locked the door. Without another word, he disappeared in the darkness on the way to the big house. Biff, if I didn't know you so well, I'd say you'd gone a little soft in the head. Charlie Keene shook his own head. Now we are both locked in. Biff was lighting a candle. In the glow of its light, Uncle Charlie could see a big smile spread over his nephew's face. You think so, Uncle Charlie? Watch this. Biff went to the door. He knelt down, holding the candle's flame at the keyhole. He placed his thumb and forefinger carefully at the keyhole opening and grasped a small wire. This ought to work. I inserted this piece of wire in the lock's catch. If it wasn't dislodged when Crunch just now opened the door, then I should be able to spring the catch with this wire. Hold your breath, Uncle Charlie. Here goes. Biff tugged smoothly but firmly on the wire. There was a sharp click. The catch was sprung. Biff pushed the door open. But where did you dig up a piece of wire, Uncle Charlie asked. Maybe Crunch is right and you do have a touch of that old black magic. Biff chuckled. Not black, Unc. Blue magic. Biff held out the separate parts of a blue plastic ballpoint pen. I remembered I had this in my pocket. I removed the steel spring from it, straightened it the best I could, and used it. "Well, I'll be—" Charlie Keene said. "Don't you remember, Uncle Charlie? You taught me that trick." Charlie Keene chuckled. "I take it all back, Biff. There's nothing soft about that head of yours. Now let's get out of here, but fast." "Why, Uncle Charlie? We can get out any time we want to. Why don't we both spend the night here? I'd like to gain Crunch's confidence completely. He could be a big help to us in Martinique. It's good to have a friend in the enemy's camp." "Yes, Biff, I think you've really got something going. We couldn't get back to Martinique tonight anyway." Biff opened the door and went out. "Where are you going?" his uncle called softly. "Back in a minute." Biff was back in less. "Had to get this," he said with a grin. He held up the alarm clock. "Heap big magic, Uncle Charlie." Biff left the door open. He and his uncle sat down on the cot. "When Crunch comes back and sees the door open," Biff laughed, "he'll really think I can out-magic a voodoo medicine man." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. Reunited. Biff and his uncle heard Crunch approaching. "I want to see this," Charlie said. He walked over to the window. Biff was right beside him. Crunch stood in the sand staring at the open door. It took several moments for the Indian to get over his amazement. He put down the food he was carrying and moved about in a shuffle, trying to make up his mind what he should do next. The giant turned suddenly and started off at a lope, intending to search the grounds for Biff and his uncle. "We're still here, Crunch," Biff called out. "We haven't escaped." Crunch stopped. He came back to the cell house slowly. Standing in the doorway, his jaw sagged open. Disbelief showed in his eyes. "No go away? No escape?" He was completely bewildered. "No, Crunch, I told you we wouldn't." "How you get door open?" Biff only smiled in reply, looking very wise and mysterious. "Magic. You make more magic." When Biff still didn't say anything, Crunch went back outside and got the food. When he came in, he placed the food on the table, then carefully locked the door. After he had done so, he looked at the key, and a foolish expression came over his face, as if he were asking himself, "Why do I lock the door?" Crunch still wore a puzzled look on his face as he sat quietly and watched Biff and Uncle Charlie eat the meal he had prepared for them. It was a fish dish with a delicious but very hot sauce. The sauce burned the eaters' mouths, making the cool, smooth avocado salad that went with it highly welcome. "That was mighty good, Crunch," Biff said. "Sure was," Uncle Charlie chimed in. He took a sip of lime drink and spoke to Biff. "We'd better turn in early. We'll want to get an early start for Martinique. Going to take Crunch with us?" "How about it, Crunch?" Biff asked. "Would you like to go to Martinique? You could see your brother. Maybe my uncle and I could help him." "Crunch have to stay here, wait for Boss Dietz." "Mr. Dietz is in Martinique, Crunch. He might need you over there," Biff said. It was going to take some time for Crunch to figure this one out. He was still afraid of Dietz. "Think it over, Crunch, and tell us in the morning," Biff said. When dawn broke and Uncle Charlie shook his sleep-drugged nephew into wakefulness, both knew that they had won Crunch completely over. He had already gone to the main house for food, and he had left the door wide open. "Made up your mind yet, Crunch?" Biff asked the Carib Indian after they had finished breakfast. "You coming with us?" Crunch was silent, still torn between his fear of Dietz and his admiration for Biff. "We're going now," Biff told him. Biff and his uncle went to the door. The Indian made no move to prevent their leaving. "Goodbye, Crunch," Biff called. Crunch stood in the doorway and watched them leave. At the arched gateway, Biff and his uncle climbed into the car. Charlie started it up. They were just beginning to roll when they heard a shout. Looking back, Biff saw Crunch coming on the run. "Wait, wait! Crunch come with you!" A completely new life was opening up for Crunch. He had never been off the island of Caraccio. He had never been in an aircraft. For the first half of the flight to Martinique, he sat rigidly in his seat. hands grasping the seat arms as if he were holding the plane in the air. "We'll stop at Fort de France first, Biff," Uncle Charlie said. "Got to pick up some diving equipment and other supplies. Then we'll hop on over to La Trinité." Flying low over the waters of the Caribbean, as his uncle came in for a landing in the harbour, Biff spotted a large net bobbing in a sweeping arc between two native boats. The fishermen doffed their broad straw hats and waved at the plane. Directly over the Seine, Biff could see thousands of fish leaping, swirling, their silver sides glittering in the sunlight. Walking through the teeming streets of the city was an experience in itself. Fort de France, with its 66,000 residents, is crowded between two rivers, gallantly named Rivière Madame and Rivière Monsieur. To Biff it seemed as if every resident of the town swarmed in the narrow street down which the three walked that morning. "Look at that," Biff said in amazement. A small native woman walked briskly among the crowd. A 60-pound basket of fruit and vegetables was balanced on her head. "Biff, these people are small, but they're powerful. And they have a magnificent sense of balance," Uncle Charlie said. In the basket which the woman wore like a headpiece were bright red tomatoes, a green pebble-skinned breadfruit, and some fat pineapples. Under one arm she carried a full stalk of bananas. The capital of Martinique was a blaze of colour, from the women's costumes to the buildings and the flowers growing riotously in every garden and patio. Beautiful bougainvillea, brilliantly coloured from rich, deep purple and red to pale lavender and violet, spilled over balconies like cascading waterfalls. Uncle Charlie led Biff and Crunch to a small hardware store. There was hardly an inch of space in the store. A heavy bathtub hung over the entrance. Garden hose, bicycles, pots, pans, fishing and skin diving equipment crowded shelves and hung from rafters. "How can anyone find anything in here?" Biff asked. "A mystery to me too, Biff," Uncle Charlie laughed. "But the clerks can put their hands on any item you ask for in a second. They're really out to serve you." Biff was giving an example of this as his uncle made his purchases. In no time at all, Biff and Crunch were laden with marking buoys, 2 scubas, self-contained, underwater breathing apparatus, and Uncle Charlie brought up the rear with a gay red and white nylon tent. "This is all we need here," he said. "We'll get the rest of the stuff we need, pots and pans and so on, in Trinité." Making their way back to the aircraft, Biff envied the natives their ability to carry tremendous loads with no apparent effort. The hop across the island to La Trinité was a short one. The plane was secured to a mooring and gear unloaded. "Well, Crunch, what are you going to do?" Uncle Charlie asked. "Find my little brother first," Crunch replied. "And what about Dietz?" Biff asked. "Maybe find him too. Where Crunch find you?" "We're going to make our headquarters here, just down the street, at the Sans Souci. We'll show you," Charles Keene said. "And if you want to find us or get in touch, ask there." "What about Derek?" Biff asked. "We've got to locate him." "Don't worry, Biff. In a town this size, everybody knows everything that's going on. I'll bet you right now the grapevine has spread word of our arrival. If Derek is around, he'll be looking us up within an hour." Charles Keene was right. He and Biff checked into the Sans Souci. Crunch went off. "A little more shopping, Biff, and we're ready to take off as soon as Derek locates us, or vice versa," Biff's uncle said. Derek caught up with Biff and Uncle Charlie in mid-afternoon. The Dutch boy was delighted to rejoin his friends. "This is really fine," he exclaimed. "So good, Biff, to be back with you and your uncle." "That goes double for me, Derek. Any news of your father?" Derek's face fell. "No, I've heard some rumors about him, but so far I've learned nothing definite as to where he might be. The island grapevine of news seems to break down just as I think I have a real clue." "Too bad, Derek," Charlie said. "But don't give up hope. We're all together now. Biff and I want to help you search for your father. It's important to me to find him too. After all, I'm working for him." "Are you working for me now too?" Derek asked with a mischievous smile. "Sure thing, Derek," Uncle Charlie agreed. "When your father's not here, you're the boss." "We'll work well together." How about it, Biff? Biff grinned. Couldn't find a better combination. I don't think we have to worry too much about diets now, Charles Keene added. That's where Uncle Charlie was wrong. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18, All Set to Dive. It was nearly 5 o'clock when Biff, Derek and Charlie Keene reached the dock in the harbour of the Baie du Trésor. They rode a truck 5 miles out of La Trinité. The truck was piled high with gear necessary to their search. A 30-foot cabin cruiser was waiting for them. Keene had chartered it as his first step after arriving in La Trinité. Slung on davits on the cruiser's stern was a 14-foot dory with an outboard motor. This was the boat from which they would do the pearl diving. With all gear stowed, Uncle Charlie started the cruiser's engine and backed away. On the dock, natives waved, calling, "Bon chance, bon chance." Good luck, good luck. Take the wheel, Biff, his uncle ordered. Head straight out while I confer with the owner. The owner? Biff and Derek glanced around the cruiser, then looked curiously at Uncle Charlie. That's you, Derek, Biff's uncle grinned. Since you're the boss, you're the owner. I'm the skipper and Biff is the crew, and I'm sure you want a tightly run ship, so look sharp there, Brewster. Aye, aye, skipper, Biff said with a smile. Now, Derek, where do we head? Uncle Charlie asked. Did your father give you any idea where this pearl fishery is? Only a vague one, Captain. Derek had entered the spirit of the game. I know that after leaving Treasure Bay Harbour, we head due south. Bring her round, mate, Keene called to Biff. Set your compass reading for a southerly run. They had left the harbour, and Biff spun the wheel. The cruiser's bow came around, and Biff held the boat on a due south course. He wrote me the spot was about 5 miles off the main coast of Martinique, Derek said, almost directly west of the town of Le François. I know the town, Keene nodded. It's a small fishing village, 10 miles down the coast. Put her at full speed, mate. We've got to make a landing before nightfall. There's a group of small islands off Le François, Derek continued. We've got to locate the right island. The fishery is a mile off one of them. Charlie Keene wiped the sweat off his forehead. Phew, not much to go on. There must be a dozen or more islands in that group. Some of them aren't more than a few acres in area. We'll make camp on one of the larger ones. Did your father give you any indication of water depth at the fishery? About 40 feet. That will help. We won't do any diving in water over, say, 50 feet. But, Derek, there's lots and lots of water around here. And there was. The coastline and pitons of Martinique were plainly visible, a lush green of wild growth, with fern trees rising as high as maples. West were the endless waters of the Atlantic Ocean. We'll need all the bon chance we can get, Biff's uncle commented. It took about an hour to make the run from Treasure Bay to the islands off Le François. Biff was still at the wheel. His uncle took out a pair of binoculars and swept his gaze over the island group. Over there, Biff, that larger one, right between those two smaller ones. Cut your speed. We don't know how these waters shoal. Derek, go forward. Watch for bottom. The cruiser approached the shore slowly. Plenty of water, Derek sang out. Then, sand. I see sand bottom, he called a little later. Ease her in, Biff. That small cove. See if you can take her in there. Give us some protection if a shabasco hits. The cruiser inched forward. The sound of the boat's keel grating on the sand bottom came to their ears. Biff cut the engine. The cruiser ground to a stop 5 feet from shore. Perfect, Biff. We'll get a little damp making the next 5 feet, but I kind of feel like a swim. How about it? Uncle Charlie suggested. Biff and Derek stripped off their shirts. Shoes and socks followed. The boys dived over the side. Charlie Keene was right behind them. All three frolicked in the warm waters of the Caribbean for a while. "All out," Uncle Charlie ordered presently. "We've got work to do. Night's coming on." The cruiser was secured, the dory was lowered and pulled up on the beach. Biff's uncle remained in the cruiser. Derek took a position waist-deep in the water halfway between the boat's bow and the shore. Charlie passed gear to Derek. Derek handed it on to Biff on shore. The unloading went smoothly and quickly. Next came the tent. It was set up. Cots were unfolded. A small table and 3 captain's chairs were put into place. "Scoop out a wide, shallow hole and line it with shells." That was Uncle Charlie's next order. He kept the boys hopping. "We'll put our stove in the shell-lined hole." Charlie ripped open a carton containing a small 2-burner propane stove and set it up. "String up the lanterns, Biff. It'll be dark soon." The job of setting up camp was completed just as the swift-falling night blanketed the tiny island with darkness. "Everything looks ship-shape to you, Skipper?" Biff asked his uncle. Charlie Keene looked around. "Can't log anything against either of you so far. Good job. Now let's eat." Biff and Derek peeled some potatoes. Uncle Charlie took a small axe and broke open a canned ham, disdaining to use the key attached to the can. "Ham and fried potatoes, how does that sound?" Uncle Charlie asked. "I could eat anything," Biff replied. "Might as well open up a can of stewed tomatoes, too." The food, although roughly prepared, seemed delicious to all three. Uncle Charlie was a good cook. The potatoes were crisp and brown. The tomatoes, well, they were just stewed tomatoes. The Danish ham had a delicate flavor unlike any Biff had eaten before. "It's rather like the hams we have in Holland," Derek said. "Only 2 problems in connection with running this camp," Uncle Charlie commented. "Air and water." "Air? I've never breathed such pure air," Biff said. "And how much water do you want than the Caribbean Sea?" Derek chimed in. "Ever tried drinking it?" Biff's uncle chuckled. "Don't! Fresh water, my lad, is what we need, and there are no springs or wells on these islands." "Well, we couldn't find any fresher air," Biff said. "You've got to admit that, Uncle Charlie." "Sure, Biff, sure. But what we want is compressed air for the scubas. Those air tanks only carry enough for an hour's diving. I have 1 extra tank. We have enough compressed air for about 2 hours diving daily. I mean 2 hours for each of you. I don't think there's any compressed air in Le François. I know there is in Trinité." "Well, that's not too far," Biff said. "We'll have to go into Trinité every day. Air and water." "And fresh food, Biff," Uncle Charlie added. Derek had been silent during this discussion. Now he spoke. "Mr. Keene, I have a plan I want to suggest." "Fire away, Derek." "Since we have to go into Trinity every day, I think we ought to do our diving in the morning." "Okay by me, Derek. Go on." "Then around noon we could go into Trinité. You and Biff could see about supplies. I'd like to spend my afternoon searching for my father. I'm more anxious to find him than to locate the pearl fishery." "We all are, Derek, and I think your plan's a good one. We could even spend the night in the Sans Souci if we get any leads that would take more than 1 afternoon to follow." "That's what I thought. Martinique's not too big an island, but there are many wild, unsettled places on it. I have a feeling that if my father is still alive, he's up in the hills somewhere." "Now, Derek, there's no reason to believe your father's not alive," Biff said softly. Derek didn't answer at once. When he did, his voice trembled slightly. "There's one thing I learned that I didn't tell you." He paused. "There was a storm, a chubasco, about the time my father disappeared. I learned that 3 days after the chubasco, parts of his boat were washed ashore south of here, near Le Valslin." Neither Biff nor his uncle replied. They knew what Derek's fear was. His father might have lost his life in the storm. "No one knows, though," Derek went on hopefully, "or seems to remember, whether the chubasco struck before or after my father was last seen in Trinité." "You mean when he mailed us our letters?" Uncle Charlie asked. "Yes," was Derek's one-word reply. "We can check that, Derek. The postmark will show the date, and the day of the chubasco will have been recorded somewhere in Trinité." "I never thought of that," Derek said. He sounded much more cheerful. Charles Keene had restored his hope. "Big day ahead of us, boys," Biff's uncle said now. "I'd say it was about time to hit the sack. You with me?" Biff and Derek were. It seemed impossible to Biff that only that morning he had been in Curazao. It also seemed to Biff that he had just heard his uncle say, "hit the sack," when his uncle's voice came to him again. This time it was, "hit the deck." Morning had come. In an hour, Biff would be at the bottom of the ocean, searching for pearls. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19, Pearl Diving. "Before we go out, we're going to have a dry run with the scubas," Biff's uncle announced. Biff, Derek and Uncle Charlie were on the beach where the cruiser was anchored. "Don't know how much skin diving you've done, Derek. You said some, but Biff can tell you that all diving equipment must be carefully and thoroughly checked out before you go down." Derek paid sharp attention. "Don your scubas," Charlie ordered. The boys quickly slipped on face masks, helmets, water lungs, snorkels. Charlie helped them strap their compressed air tanks on their backs. Next, the boys put on their weight belts. Into a rubber scabbard on each belt went a wickedly sharp knife. There were sharks in these waters. A depth gauge and watch were strapped on each boy's left wrist. Charlie inspected each item of diving equipment carefully. He tugged at the straps, examined each piece of gear separately. "Jettison belts," he called out suddenly. With a flip of his hand, Biff hit the catch on his weight belt. It dropped to the sand. Derek was a few seconds longer. "Seconds can count, Derek, if you get into trouble. Try it again." Derek slipped his weight belt back on. Charlie shouted the order. Derek hit the catch and his belt dropped. "That's better, Derek. Remember, that belt is what holds you down. If you have to come up fast, you've got to get rid of that belt fast." "But don't try to come up too fast, Derek," Biff said, "especially if you're down deep." "Biff's right. A good rule to follow is not to rise to the surface any faster than the escaping air bubbles. Your body has to adjust to the variations in water pressure. All right, let's go out and try it in the water now." They climbed in the dory. Uncle Charlie started the outboard, and they moved offshore about 50 feet. "Sound for depth, Biff." Biff dropped a sounding line overboard. He pulled it up, examined the leads, marking off every 3 feet. 30 feet, Uncle Charlie." "Okay, now you know how to clear your masks." Both boys nodded their heads. "I want to hear you tell me." Biff began promptly. "If water seeps into your mask, clouding the glass and obscuring your vision, you roll over on your back." "Take it from there, Derek," Charlie cut in. Then you blow air out through your nose. The air pressure building up in the mask will force the water out around the edges of the mask." "Good. You both know the most important safety feature of skin diving. Okay, over you go." The boys slipped their swim fins or flippers on their feet and lowered themselves overboard. They sank slowly to the bottom. At this point, the bottom was smooth, clean white sand. Biff and Derek moved around, using their legs and feet only for propulsion. Biff came up to Derek, circled his thumb and forefinger together, indicating that everything was going smoothly. Derek replied with the V for victory sign. Then they rose to the surface. When they broke water, Charlie Keene was waiting with another order. "Down again, and as soon as you touch bottom, jettison your belts." Down they went. Charles Keene was taking no chances on the boys' safety and ability to skin dive. Up popped the boys, their wet heads appearing above the water first and looking like strange creatures from the deep. Biff flipped back his face mask. "Good work, Biff, but you've got to go back down and retrieve the weight belts. Here's a spare. You'd find it tough to get down 30 feet without it." Derek climbed aboard the dory while Biff submerged to pick up the belts. He had to make 2 trips. The weight of 3 belts would have held him down. "We might as well start our search off this island first." "Good as any." The dory sped out to a point Uncle Charlie estimated to be about a mile away. The anchor was tossed overboard. The sounding line showed the water depth at just over 45 feet. "I want you to take this spear along with you, Biff." Uncle Charlie handed his nephew a wicked, lethal-looking weapon. The tip was needle-sharp. "I doubt you'll run into any bad fish here, but you might. And do not use it except in case of extreme danger. If you spear an attacking fish, shark, barracuda, or octopus, remember any blood will attract other sharks and then you'll be in real trouble." Biff took the spear and examined it. "Each of you take one of these wire baskets. They're to load the oysters in, if you find any. I'm the puller up. I've a line on each basket. Now get these signals. I want both of you to give me one sharp tug every 10 minutes. That will tell me you're okay. Give 2 sharp tugs when your basket is filled. I'll pull the basket up, unload it and lower it again. Now, in case of emergency, a series of sharp tugs will alert me, and I'll be right down. Got it? Okay, over you go." The bottom was different this time. Instead of clean white sand, the bottom was covered with a layer of mud mixed with sand. Biff felt around carefully. Both boys were wearing thick rubber gloves to protect their hands against the sharp, jagged oyster shells. As Biff was feeling around in the mud, Derek swam over to him. He held a large oyster in front of Biff's mask. They popped it in his basket. Biff's hand touched a large shell. He dug it out and discarded it. It was a clam. He ran into a nest of oysters. He quickly filled his basket and gave the signal to haul up. Minutes later, the basket came down, swaying in the water at the bottom of the line. The boys worked slowly, carefully, feeling their way. Every so often a large fish would swim up to them, coming right to the face mask as if to ask, "What are you doing down here?" Biff kept a sharp check on his watch. He knew his air tank had sufficient air to remain submerged for 1 hour. It also had a 5-minute emergency supply in addition. Biff had no intention of waiting until he had to use the extra air. After being down 55 minutes, he signaled Derek. With his forefinger, he pointed upward. Derek got the idea. The boys began their slow ascent. Rising, looking up towards the surface, they could see the dory outlined above, a fat, cigar-shaped blob. Breaking water as they surfaced, each boy grabbed the dory's gunwale. They were both tired. Neither had realized how the water pressure at 45 feet had sapped their strength. They had been down nearly an hour. "You don't know what a tough job diving is until you've been down for a good spell," Charlie said. He leaned over the side and helped the boys into the boat. They took off their diving equipment. "Had enough for today, boys?" Biff's uncle inquired. "Oh, no, we'll go down again after we rest," Biff replied. "All right with you, Derek?" Derek nodded his head. "Actually, I don't see much point in going back down," Uncle Charlie said. "We've got 10 baskets of oysters. We might as well shuck them and see if we find any pearls. If we don't, then we'll say goodbye to this spot and try another tomorrow." "Now I like that idea," Biff said, and stretched out on the narrow seat that ran around the side of the dory. His uncle upped anchor, and they headed back to their island camp. They didn't go into Trinité that day, since they still had the reserve tank of compressed air and enough food for supper. The afternoon was spent at the tedious job of opening oysters. It was slow going. None of the 3 had the skill of a professional oyster opener. The job was totally unrewarding. "Not one pearl," Biff sighed. "Not even a single tiny one," Derek said sadly. "Now, don't be downhearted, boys," Uncle Charlie said, trying to cheer them up. "Can't expect to hit it the first day. At any rate, we've got enough oysters to make a stew." "If we had some milk," Biff said. "Afraid not, Biff." "Yeah, where are we going to get milk? A sea cow, maybe? Wish we'd kept some of them. We could have had an oyster roast." "Wrong again, Biff," Charlie said. "Pearl oysters aren't edible. These would make you so sick you wouldn't be any good for 10 days." "What a waste," Biff said, and stretched out on the sand. Every muscle, every bone in his body ached. All 3 went to bed that night right after supper. Biff, having slept heavily, awoke just as dawn broke. He thought he had been awakened by the sound of a boat's motor. He listened intently. No sound. Biff turned over on his narrow cot, determined to get back to sleep. He was just drifting off when he heard a sound outside the tent, just beyond where his cot touched the inside of the tent wall. He waited tensely. The sound was only a faint rustle. He saw the side of the tent stretch as if something was crawling underneath it. Biff raised himself on one elbow, ready to sound the alarm. As he watched in the faint dawn light, a thick, snake-shaped object slithered up between his cot and the tent's side. End of Chapter 19. Chapter 20. Enemy Invasion. Biff moved quickly, noiselessly out of his cot. In the increasing daylight, he could see that the strange object slithering over his bed was a huge arm. He went over to his uncle, shook him gently, and when Charlie Keene roused, Biff cautioned silence, pressing a finger to his lips. Biff pointed to his cot. Charlie Keene saw the arm and was up in a flash. From under his pillow he took a gun. This action startled Biff even more than the mysterious arm. He had no idea that his uncle thought they were in such danger that there was reason for keeping a gun close at hand. "Stay here," Uncle Charlie whispered. "I'll slip outside." Biff kept his eyes on the arm. He saw the arm slide over the cot, saw the hand feel it. The hand withdrew quickly. The arm slipped back outside the tent. "Hold it," Biff heard his uncle command. This stern order was followed by an amazed, "Why, what are you doing here?" "Biff, come running." Biff leapt out of the tent. In the morning light he saw his uncle holding a gun on the giant Carib Indian, Crunch. Crunch! Biff's astonishment turned to delight at seeing his simple, friendly enemy again. "What in the world? Why did you sneak up on us like this?" he exclaimed. Crunch stepped over to Biff. "Not know who might be intent. Want to find my friend, you. Have story of big trouble for you and your friends." "What is it, Crunch? Tell me." "It is Boss Dietz. See Crunch in Trinité. Make Crunch come back and work for him. Last night, Dietz and Specs make camp on next island." Crunch pointed in the direction of an island about half a mile away. "They leave Crunch to guard camp, but Crunch hear them talk. Tonight, when you all asleep, they come to this island. They going to break up your boats. Crunch wait until they far away, then come over here to give you warning. Dietz bad man, very." Crunch left his sentence hanging in air. He stared in disbelief at the front of the tent. He was looking at Derek. His eyes swung from Derek to Biff, then back to Derek and back again from one boy to the other. "It's more magic!" Crunch howled, terror in his voice. He turned to run. "Wait, Crunch, stop!" Biff ran over to the Indian and took him by the arm. "It's no more magic. There are really two of us. Me, I'm Biff. That's my name. He's my friend Derek. Come here, Derek." Derek joined them. "Touch him, Crunch." Crunch's hand went out carefully. He touched Derek, then drew his hand back quickly. "You see, Crunch, he's not a ghost, not a spirit. He's a real person, just like I am. The only thing, we look very much alike." Crunch could only shake his head. If his faith in Biff had not been so great, he would have turned and fled. "All right, Crunch, you believe me? You know you're not just seeing things." Crunch nodded his head slowly. "Okay, Crunch, we want to thank you for giving us this warning. No want you to get hurt. Now Crunch go before Boss comes back." Biff and Derek walked to the edge of the water with Crunch. "I'll fix some chow," Uncle Charlie called. The boys watched Crunch climb into a small dory and row off. He was facing them as he pulled away, and he was still staring from one boy to the other. "What do we do now?" Biff asked when he and Derek rejoined Charlie Keene. "We carry on as if we knew nothing. We'll explore another place this morning. We'll go to Trinity this afternoon and replenish our air and food supplies. Tonight we'll be ready to give Dietz an unexpected reception." The pearl diving that morning was no more productive than it had been the previous day. Noon found the three in the cabin cruiser heading for Trinité. In town, Derek left Biff and his uncle. He was off on his quest for his father. The three met again at the pre-arranged hour of 6 o'clock and embarked for the return trip to their island camp. Tension mounted as the evening hours on the island dragged slowly by. At 11 p.m., Charlie Keene arose from his cot. He had ordered Biff and Derek to try and rest. "Let's go." The boys followed Uncle Charlie down to the cabin cruiser and the dory. "You both know what you're to do?" he asked. "Yes, Mr. Keene," Derek replied. "All set, Uncle Charlie," Biff said. "Crunch may or may not be with them." I imagine he will be, but I'm sure we don't have to worry about him now. Okay, Derek, into the cruiser. Biff, you and I will hide behind the dory. Derek, you know where to start and what to do. I do. All right, take your positions. Derek waded out and climbed aboard the cruiser. Biff and his uncle dug into the sand on the beach side of the dory. Their wait began. It seemed endless. Biff kept glancing at the illuminated dial of his watch. 12 o'clock, 12:30. Think maybe they found out that Crunch warned us? Biff asked in a low voice. I don't think so, Biff. How would they? Just after 1 o'clock, Biff and his uncle came alert. From a distance over the water they heard the sound of a boat engine. It grew louder as the boat drew nearer. Then the sound stopped suddenly. Biff was puzzled. Engine trouble, or had they given up the idea, he whispered. Wait, his uncle whispered back. After a few minutes a new sound came to their ears. The sound of oars rasping against oarlocks, the soft splash of oar blades dipping in and out of the water. Biff knew now why the engine had been cut, so Dietz could approach without awakening his prey. The sound of a boat grating gently on sand was heard next. Dietz and company had made their landing. Biff and his uncle could hear two men conversing in low voices. The voices came nearer. The enemy was standing directly across from where Biff and his uncle lay hidden behind the dory. Walk up to the tent, Crunch. It was Dietz's voice. Keep them from coming down here if they wake up. Okay, Specs, start drilling. That was the plot. Drill holes in the dory, make it unfloatable. What devilment had they planned for the cruiser? These thoughts flashed through Biff's mind. Just as Specs lifted one leg over the gunwale, Charlie Keene, still hidden, let go with his automatic. 8 shots in rapid succession shattered the night silence. From the cabin cruiser came blast after blast from the boat's foghorn. Rump! Harump! Harump! Specs leapt out of the dory. They're laying for us, Dietz shouted. Run for the boat! Uncle Charlie had slipped in another cartridge clip, and this time his 8 rapid-fire shots were aimed just over the heads of the fleeing Dietz and Specs. Derek kept working the foghorn. The noise tore at the night. Dietz slipped and fell into the water as he jumped for his boat. Specs was frantically shoving it off the beach. Dietz scrambled in. Bullets from the automatic's 3rd clip were stinging the water around Dietz's boat like angry wasps. The frightened pair finally got their engine started, backed off at full throttle, swung round and headed out to sea. The foghorn continued its angry growling. Okay, Derek, Uncle Charlie called. Lay off! They're long gone. Derek joined Biff and his uncle, and they watched the light of the fast disappearing boat. Then, the tension relieved, the three sank down on the sand and howled with laughter. When Biff was finally able to control his laughing spell, he got up with a start. Crunch, he exclaimed. What happened to him? I didn't see him get in the boat. He's probably halfway across the Atlantic by now, Charlie answered, swimming his lungs out to get away from the evil spirits. A search of the small island was started. Crunch was found on the far side, cowering behind a small sand dune. Once the giant Indian had been calmed down, and Biff had to work hard on him to convince him the evil spirits had fled, Crunch fell to his knees and, with outstretched arms, said to Biff, Please, Crunch, stay with you now, work for you. Do anything you say. Crunch afraid to go back to Boss Dietz. Good for you, Crunch. Glad to have you join us. The four walked back to the tent. I don't know where you're going to sleep, Crunch, Biff said doubtfully. Crunch not sleep. Stand guard outside tent, the Indian replied. Biff turned to his uncle. What's Dietz trying to accomplish now, he asked. Harassment, Biff. Stalling. Working out a plan. First of all, he wants to be around when we locate the exact spot of the pearl fishery. Then, well... Then what, Mr. Keene? Derek asked. Nothing to worry about, Derek. You're holding something back, Mr. Keene. I want to know the truth. I want to know what I'm in for. Charlie Keene spoke in a quiet voice, but his words were chilling. As far as he knows, your father is gone, Derek. If Dietz can get rid of you, then the claim becomes open again. End of Chapter 20. Chapter 21, A Gay Deception. Although the attack by Dietz and Company had had a comic ending, Biff, his uncle and Derek realized that the next such attack might have more serious consequences. The three had settled down on the soft white sand. No one spoke, their minds whirling with thoughts of Dietz. The giant Indian, Crunch, was a few feet removed, squatting on his huge haunches and chewing on a piece of salt grass. Charles Keene looked at his nephew. "Doing some heavy thinking, Biff?" he inquired. "Trying to, Uncle Charlie. Look." He paused, then went on. "I have a feeling that since Dietz failed in this try, he'll grow even more desperate. I mean, the next time he tries, he probably won't be so easy to scare off." "You're absolutely right, Biff." The boy was silent again. He wanted to be clear in his own mind before he advanced the proposal he had outlined to himself. "Derek, I don't want you to be offended by what I'm about to say. It's just that I want to get my thinking clear, okay? Nothing you could say, Biff, could make me feel angry with you." "Thanks, Derek." The two boys looked at one another in the starlit night. The bond of friendship between them had grown stronger with each passing day. "It's this, Derek. Finding the pearl fishery is of secondary importance to you. Finding your father comes first. You know that, Biff." Charles Keene waited. He knew his nephew was cooking up a plan. He also knew that most of Biff's plans had merit. "Well then," Biff continued, "as I see it, we're faced with two big problems. First, if we abandon our search for the pearl fishery to devote all our time to looking for your father, then we give Dietz a wide open field to try and find the fishery. That's not good." "No, it isn't, Biff, but I must find my father," Derek replied earnestly. "Very true, Biff," Uncle Charlie said. "It's quite a problem." Charles Keene offered no suggestions. He was anxious to see how his nephew would attack the problem, what solution he might come up with. "Uncle Charlie, a few moments ago you used the word harassment. You said that would be the chief tactic used by Dietz to delay our locating the pearl fishery," Biff said. "He'll double his efforts if I'm any judge. What's on your mind?" "If we can pull it off," Biff was thinking out loud. "Pull what off, Biff?" Derek asked. "I've got a plan. I want to know what you and Uncle Charlie think of it." "Fire away, Biff," his uncle invited. "It's this. Suppose tomorrow we pretend to find the fishery. We'll fire off guns, blast off on the boat horn, dance around the beach like mad, in full sight of Dietz, of course, make him think we've located the site. Only, of course, we'll do all this where we know there are no pearls. We'll put on our act at one of the first places we tackled, before Dietz became so vigilant. What do you think?" "You've got something there, Biff. I'm proud of you," Biff's uncle replied. "It would be fun, too, to fool Dietz," Derek chimed in excitedly. "To make it even more convincing," Biff went on, "we could break camp tomorrow afternoon, pull out fast. Dietz wouldn't follow us immediately, not until he'd done some diving and oyster shucking himself. He'd surely want to make certain we had located the fishery." "You're darn right he would," Charles Keene said. "That would give us a chance to get back to Trinité, slip out of town and really concentrate on looking for your father." Biff paused. He looked first at Derek. He felt sure Derek would be enthusiastic about his plan. Then he looked at his uncle. He knew his uncle was considering the plan in every detail. Uncle Charlie finally spoke. "Well, Biff, I like your plan. You didn't know this, of course, but I was getting more and more worried about having you and Derek on the bottom of the ocean, with Dietz in his high-powered boat ready to strike at any moment. Calling off the pearl search for the time being makes a lot of sense." "And maybe we'll find my father," Derek said. "If he's on the island, we'll find him," Charles Keene said. He spoke with more conviction than he felt, to cheer the Dutch boy up. Privately, he had many doubts as to the possibility of finding Derek's father. "Crunch, go along. Help find lost white man." It was the first time the giant Indian had spoken. Biff shot a fast glance at his uncle. Charles Keene shook his head. The motion was barely noticeable, but Biff got it. He knew his uncle had some other plan for the Carib. "I don't know, Crunch," Biff said. He knew the Indian wanted to remain in the party. "I think maybe my uncle has an idea where you could be a lot more help." "Right, Uncle Charlie?" Charles Keene turned to the Indian. "If you want to be a big help to us, Crunch, it would be better for you to go back to Dietz." "No like Dietz, bad man." "We know that, Crunch, but while we're gone, it will only be a few days. You can keep an eye on Dietz. You'd still be on our side, but Dietz wouldn't know that. He'd think you were still working for him. You'd be our spy." "Crunch a spy?" From the tone of the Indian's voice, Biff could tell that Crunch was pleased. He liked the idea of being a spy. "That's right, Crunch," Uncle Charlie continued. "You'd pretend to be still working for him, but you'd watch everything he did. He might even find the pearl fishery, and we'd sure want to know about that. Then, when we got back, you could tell us everything that had been going on. How about it?" "Crunch, do it. He go now." The Indian rose to his feet and faded into the night for his half-mile swim back to the island camp of the enemy. Biff wondered what kind of reception he would receive from Dietz, but felt sure Crunch could take care of himself. The next morning the boys and Charles Keene were up at the first crack of dawn. Over a hasty breakfast they went over their plan for the last time. As the sun boiled up out of the Atlantic, the three headed out to sea. It wasn't long before they saw Dietz's boat come into sight, rocking above the horizon off their starboard side. "Here we go," Charles Keene said. "Drop anchor." Derek heaved the hook over. Biff was already donning his diving apparatus. Derek was only a few months behind as Biff slipped into the warm waters of the Caribbean and made his descent. The boys stayed down for about half an hour. When they surfaced and climbed aboard, Biff cracked open an oyster. Immediately he let out a shout and danced up and down. Derek joined in the deception. Charlie Keene put his head together with the two boys, and for several moments they carefully inspected an imaginary pearl in Biff's empty hand. They all knew Dietz was observing their actions through powerful binoculars. With happy shouts that bounced across the waves and reached Dietz's boat, Biff and Derek plunged back into the water. They sent up several more baskets of oysters. When they surfaced and climbed back into the boat, they chucked a few more oysters. Then Charles Keene shook each boy's hand and clapped them on the back. "Up anchor!" Charlie shouted. He started the motor. The boat raced back to the campsite. "Look back over your shoulder, Uncle Charlie," Biff said. Dietz had brought his boat into the area just abandoned by the boys and Uncle Charlie. "Isn't he dropping a marking buoy right about where we were?" Biff asked. "He sure is." "Then we did fool him," Derek sang out happily. "For the time being at least, but we've got to move fast. He'll be sampling oysters from that same bed as fast as he can." The three struck camp quickly. They loaded their gear into the cabin cruiser. With a triumphant blast on the boat horn and a burst of shots from Charles Keene's gun, they pointed the bow of the cruiser toward La Trinité. They passed within a quarter of a mile of Dietz's boat. They could see Dietz hauling in lines holding the baskets of oysters which Specs had filled on the bottom. They didn't see Crunch. He must have been pressed into oyster diving also. 10 minutes later they could barely see Dietz's white boat bobbing on the blue water over the imaginary pearl bed. "We pulled it off, Uncle Charlie," Biff said. "That we did, Biffo, me lad." "And now we can hunt for my father," Derek added. "And we'll find him too," Biff said confidently. Charles Keene frowned. He erased the frown quickly, but not so fast that Biff missed it. Biff knew his uncle believed that Bromzook must have been lost at sea. The thought sent Biff's high spirits plunging downward. End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22. Dashed Hopes. In La Trinité, Biff, his uncle and Derek moved about with haste. Following a speedy lunch, they shopped for enough supplies to last them for their expedition into the interior of Martinique. "Step lively, boys," Uncle Charlie urged. "It won't take Dietz long to find out he's been fooled, and we don't want him hounding us on this search." "Uncle Charlie," Biff said, "if Dietz comes into Trinité and finds our boat still moored in Treasure Bay, won't he know we're still somewhere nearby?" "That's a chance we'll have to take, Biff. But if we took the boat up the coast, got it away from here, that would cause him further delay, wouldn't it?" "You're right again, Biff. "But why would Dietz want to follow us when we're searching for my father?" Derek asked. "He wants to know about your father as much as we do, but for different reasons," Charles Keene replied, a frown darkening his face. Derek thought this over. "If we learn some bad news about my father, if we should learn he really is gone," Derek gulped. He couldn't bring himself to say out loud that they might find out that Brom Zook was dead. "If that is how our search should end, then you mean there could be some doubt as to whether the claim he originally filed is still valid?" "Afraid so, Derek. I believe your claim would be supported in time, but there would be delay after delay as Dietz went to the courts to try and have it invalidated." "I see." Biff wanted to get his friend Derek's mind away from such depressing thoughts. "About the boat again, Uncle Charlie. Why don't we go around the point, head north along the coast and find a sheltered harbour where we could hide the boat? Then we could head inland from there." "That's what we'll do, Biff, and let's do it right away," his uncle agreed. They made a run of about 10 miles along the east coast of Martinique and found a small cove between St. Marie and Marigot. They beached the boat and covered it with lacy leaves of the giant fern trees which grow to a height of 20 feet on Martinique. Over the ferns they spread palm fronds. The boat was completely hidden. From the beach they could see the peak of Mount Pelée, rising nearly 5,000 feet in the air. "Boys, what do you say we make Pelée our first goal?" Charles Keene suggested. "Your searches haven't brought you that far north and east, have they, Derek?" "No, sir." "Okay, let's move out then." Each of the three slung a pack over his shoulders, and they plunged into the thick tropical growth. Biff was enjoying himself. If the object of their search hadn't been such a serious one, if his feeling that the search might have an unhappy ending hadn't been so strong, then the exploration would have been even more fun. Martinique, Biff soon discovered, was a truly beautiful island, one of the most beautiful places in which he had ever been. From the top of steep ridges, the lush, fertile valleys of the island spread out below. Rugged peaks rose like steeples above the ridges. In the rich valleys, they crossed through sugar-cane fields. Biff took his knife and slashed the stock down. Its sweet juices oozed out of the slash. Biff pressed the stock to his lips and sucked deeply. "Try one, Derek. Tastes good," he said. Banana trees grew wild almost everywhere they went. Derek skinned up the rough, fat trunk of one tree and yanked down a bunch. He squirreled back down the tree and plopped on the ground to inspect his haul. Derek's hands were exploring the bunch, trying to select the ripest, fattest banana, when Charlie Keene leapt to his side and struck the Dutch boy's arm a sharp blow. Derek looked around in amazed alarm. Charles Keene was stamping on a hairy black spider. He had spotted the ugly insect on Derek's shoulder, and with one swift blow had knocked the spider to the ground. "What's the matter, Mr. Keene?" Derek looked frightened. "Close call, Derek. That spider I just knocked off your arm is called Matatutu falaise. That's the local French name for the most poisonous spider on the island. They make their nests in bananas." Derek's face went white. "It's all right now, I got him. But after this, be mighty careful when you pick a banana," Uncle Charlie warned. Now and again the party would pass a small thatched hut. At each one they asked questions of the inhabitants. A tall man, very thin with almost white hair, was the description they gave of Brom Zook. "He's been missing over 3 months." The natives would only shake their heads. No, they had not seen such a man, nor had they heard of such a stranger in these parts. For 3 days the party trudged up and down the ridges and peaks of the island. They questioned 100 or more people. They went to Deux Chaux, to Montvert, La Lorraine, Grande Riviera, and towns even smaller. Nowhere did they get any leads to a missing Hollander named Brom Zook. By the 4th day of the search, it was plain to Biff and his uncle that Derek was becoming more and more discouraged, more and more disheartened. They tried their best to cheer up the Dutch lad. At the end of the day, they reached the top of Mount Pelée. Looking down at the sea, they could pick out the ruins of Saint-Pierre. Once, Uncle Charlie told the boys, Saint-Pierre had been the largest city on the island. Then, in the early morning hours, tragedy had struck. "You know the story about Saint-Pierre and Mount Pelée, Biff?" Uncle Charlie asked. "You must have heard it, Derek, when you were growing up in Curazao." Derek shook his head. "No, I don't remember it, Mr. Keene. It was just after the turn of the century, around 1902, I believe. St. Pierre then had a population of 30,000 people. Early one morning, as the city slept, Mount Pelée erupted. It shot forth a sheet of flame and molten lava. In a matter of only a few seconds, 30,000 people were dead. Most of them died in their beds." "The whole city wiped out? In seconds?" Biff asked incredulously. "That's right, Biff," Charlie Keene said. "There was only one survivor." "How could one person survive when 30,000 others perished?" Biff demanded. "It's a most unusual story. This person was a prisoner in St. Pierre. He was in a solitary confinement. The cell he was in had stone walls several feet thick. That's what saved him. The walls were so thick they resisted the heat. The prisoner didn't even know about the catastrophe until several days later, when rescue crews explored the prison." Biff could only shake his head. That night they camped on top of the volcano and went into St. Pierre the next morning. "As you can see," Uncle Charlie pointed out, "the town has been partly rebuilt, but today only 6,000 persons live here, where 50 years ago St. Pierre had 30,000 residents." Inquiries were made at the police station. The three searchers could hardly believe their ears. They received their first lead. "Now, I do not know the man's name," the police officer said, "but a man of such a description as you give has been staying in a small pension just outside the city for the last few months." Where is it?" Derek cried out. "I will be only too happy to take you there," the courteous officer replied. They rode through the volcanic ruins of St. Pierre toward the gentle slope that led towards Mount Pelée. Although some sections had been built up, there were still plenty of signs of the savage destruction caused by Mount Pelé's eruption over half a century before. Derek was in the front seat with the police officer. Biff and Charles Keene were in the rear seat. Biff had his fingers crossed. Both the boys and his uncle were praying that the man the police officer referred to might be Derek's father. The car drew up before a small vine-covered house. Derek leapt out. The police officer led the way. Biff and Charles Keene were right behind. A broad veranda swept around three sides of the house. The officer made an inquiry, then motioned Derek to follow him. Biff was a step behind Derek. At the far end of the veranda they could see a man sitting in a high-backed wicker chair, his back to them. As they approached the chair, Biff kept his eyes on Derek. The Dutch boy rushed forward and turned to confront the man in the chair. Biff watched the expression on Derek's face. Biff read his answer from the disappointment which spread over his friend's features. The man was not Brom Zook. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23, Diets Again. In the morning, the three breakfasted in silence. Biff wanted to say something to cheer up Derek. But what was there to say? Derek's face was white and drawn. It was plain to see that the Dutch boy had had little, if any, sleep the night before. It was Derek who broke the silence. "I want to thank you both," he said, "but I don't feel that I can ask you to continue this search any longer." "We'll go along with you just as long as you want us to," Biff spoke up loyally. "Right, Uncle Charlie?" "Certainly, Biff." "No, it's no use," Derek continued. "Not in this section of Martinique. I'm sure that if my father were anywhere around here, we'd have heard something about it. Some rumor, some tale of a tall white man." "I agree with you there, Derek," Charles Keene said. "But there is much of Martinique still to be searched. The southern part, down around English Bay. That's south of the spot where we believe your father located the pearl fishery. He might have gone into hiding down that way." "You mean, don't you, Mr. Keene," Derek said bravely, "that if he was lost at sea and washed ashore, then it would be in that section of Martinique?" Charles Keene didn't reply. Derek had read his thoughts. Right after breakfast, the three headed back across Martinique toward the cove where they had hidden their boat. It was about a 20-mile trip, and they reached the spot just at dark. "I think we'd better spend the night here," Uncle Charlie said. "I don't know this coast too well. Might run into a reef if we try to make it to Trinity tonight." Exhausted from their long and fruitless search, the three slept that night under a clear sky, the sleep of the overtired. The sun was already up and blazing when they awoke. A quick swim refreshed them after their hard sleep, and half an hour later they were on their way back down the coast. They reached Trinité by mid-morning. After mooring the boat, they held a conference. "What are your plans now, Derek?" Biff asked. "Well, we could continue searching for the pearl fishery, or we could go south and look for your father," Biff completed Derek's thought. "What about this?" Uncle Charlie cut in. "Suppose Biff and I keep on looking for the pearls, and you go off for a few days on your own." Biff frowned at these words. He knew his uncle's intentions were good, but he also felt that if Derek left them, he'd be cut off from the only friends he had on Martinique. He'd be lonely and engaged in the search with his heart heavy at the prospect of what he might discover. Biff didn't quite know how to tell his uncle this. He didn't want to contradict him. He didn't have to. As he was puzzling a way out of the suggestion made by his uncle, he heard a shout. He looked in the direction the hail had come from. Lumbering down the dock, a broad grin on his strong face, came Crunch. The giant Indian was delighted to rejoin Biff, his uncle and Derek. Brilliant white teeth glinted in the sunlight as Crunch wore a perpetual grin on his face. "What about Dietz?" Uncle Charlie asked. "Did he locate the pearl fishery while we were gone?" Biff's question tumbled out after his uncle's. "No fine fishery," Crunch said, still grinning. "Dietz look hard, though. Very mad when he find how you fool him." "Good," Biff said. All of them smiled at his news. "But Dietz do something else," Crunch went on. "Him get some kind of paper from government." "What do you mean, Crunch? What sort of paper?" Charles Keene asked. Crunch not understand. Ask questions, though. Paper say maybe you don't find fishery very sudden, then claim no good any more. "How can that be, Uncle Charlie?" Biff asked. "I don't know, Biff. I'd have to see a copy of it." "Copy of paper nailed up in post office," Crunch said. "What are we waiting for, then? Let's go." They leapt into a native taxi, urging the driver to speed and more speed. The taxi creaked and groaned, but it got them there. In the post office, the three read the copy of the document carefully. "It's not so good, is it, Uncle Charlie?" Biff asked. "No, it isn't." "I don't quite understand it, Mr. Keene," Derek said. "Well, Derek, cutting through the legal phraseology, it comes down to this. Dietz went to Fort de France while we were searching for your father. He has challenged your right to the claim, on the grounds that you're a minor. How old are you, Derek?" "I'll be 18 my next birthday." "Well, what Dietz has obtained, in legal terms, is a temporary injunction. It goes into effect 5 days from now. At that time, the claim and the working permit will be suspended until the courts decide whether Derek is the rightful heir to the claim." "I'm sorry, Derek," Charlie Keene said soberly, "but Dietz has obtained this injunction on the grounds that your father is deceased." After a few moments' silence, Biff spoke up. "We still have 5 days, then, to find the fishery. If we did, how would that affect the injunction?" "Well, going back to the unwritten law of finders keepers, Derek would have an excellent chance of retaining the rights, despite any court battle Dietz might put up." "What do you say, Derek?" Biff asked. "Shall we go pearl fishing again? I know you want to continue the search for your father, but—" "I'm with you, Biff. It's only 5 days. And then, whether we find the fishery or not, we'll all continue looking for your father until the case comes up in court." "One moment there, young fellow," Uncle Charlie cut in. "I'll continue with Derek. You won't be here." "Won't be here?" Biff was amazed. "Where am I going to be?" "On your way back to Indianapolis." "Oh, school. I forgot." Biff's face fell. "But we've got 5 days still. Let's make the most of them," said his uncle. It took them 2 hours to restock their supplies, get air for the diving tanks, and return to the dock. At the end of the dock, lounging against a mooring post, was Dietz. He had an evil expression of triumph on his face. "Don't you ever give up," he said. Specks hovered behind him. None of the three answered their enemy. They got into the boat and prepared to cast off. "Hey, come back here. Where do you think you're going?" Dietz's startled question was directed at Crunch. Crunch had jumped into the boat with the others. "Crunch go with friends. No work for bad man any more." "You'll still be working for me," Dietz shouted back in anger. "If you find the fishery, you'll be finding it for me, because I'll win it in court." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. Attack from the Deep. For the next 3 days, activity went on at a feverish pace. Camp was hastily set up again on the same island, and even when it was late in the day, Biff, Derek and Uncle Charlie would try another spot, hoping to locate the fishery. They dived from sun-up to sundown. The only rest period for Biff and Derek came when Uncle Charlie dashed into Trinity to replenish the air tanks. The piles of shucked oyster shells grew higher and higher. No pearls were found. The boys worked desperately against time, but as the first day passed, then the second, then the third, they worked with heavy hearts. The time limit was drawing near. Dietz made no further attacks. He was content now to fight his battle in the courts. But the pearl fishers knew he was still in the area. They saw his boat from time to time. He was keeping his distance, but he was still watching. However, even by using binoculars, Dietz would be unable to determine whether the boys located the pearl fishery. He could only learn this by finding out the results of the daily diving. He would have to know what the opened oysters yielded. For this reason, a nightly guard was kept. Although Dietz was going to use the courts, the search party didn't want him to know if and when they did locate the fishery. Crunch insisted on taking the night guard duty. He also worked during the day. Biff often wondered when the big Indian slept. Although the danger from Dietz was lessened, Charlie Keene kept reminding the boys of the danger that always awaited them when they were diving. It struck suddenly and viciously on the 4th morning of their diving. Biff and Derek were down in 48 feet of water. They had been digging out oysters for half an hour. Basket after basket had been hauled up. Waiting for his basket to be lowered to him, Biff was suddenly spun round by a swirl of water. It felt as if he'd been caught in a whirlpool. Biff cleared his mask. He looked around. Coming at him out of the murky dark waters was a giant shark. The killer swept by within a foot, then turned and slashed back. Biff looked frantically for Derek. He saw his glimmering white shape 10 feet away. Approaching Derek was a second shark. The sharks hadn't struck yet. It seemed they were inspecting their prey, waiting before their razor-sharp teeth tore at the boys' bodies. Biff swam quickly over to Derek. He grabbed his arm and pointed. The two huge sharks were motionless, their wicked eyes on the boys. Biff took a deep breath, raised his mask just enough to clear his mouth, and shouted as loud as he could. His shout, of course, made no sound, but Biff knew that the force of the breath expelled by his shark would send a shock wave in the direction of the sharks. He had read that this was one of the best ways of delaying an attack by an undersea monster. The shout worked. The sharks swam around the boys in circles, but Biff knew that any second they would strike. There was no time now to go by the book in getting back to the surface. Biff jammed his face mask on, quickly cleared it of water, grabbed Derek by the arm and shoved him upward. He himself followed, propelling himself as fast as he could. Both boys had jettisoned their belts instantly. Breaking the surface, Biff gasped to his uncle, "Sharks!" Uncle Charlie lost no time. He grabbed Derek, who was closer, and hauled him into the boat. Crunch lifted Biff in. They were no sooner in the boat than two shark fins cut the water, circling nearer and nearer to the craft. Biff and Derek lay gasping on the bottom of the boat. Their rapid ascent had drained their bodies of oxygen and strength. Biff's uncle quickly started the motor and got away from the spot at full speed. He had seen the size of the sharks. They were big enough to overturn the dory if they struck. By the time they reached the island camp, the boys had somewhat recovered, but Biff was still shaking as if he had a chill, and Derek's face was drawn and white. The narrow escape the boys had undergone was not without its reward, however. All four of the pearl fishers, Crunch was now one of them, were shucking oysters after a rest and the noonday meal. Biff, growing more and more bored with the tough job of opening and examining oysters, was about to discard a shell when he noticed a raised protuberance on the exact center on the shell. He took off his gloves and dug at the raised part with a fingernail. His excitement grew. Seconds later, he dug out an almost perfectly shaped white pearl. "I've got one! I've got one!" he shouted. The others crowded around him. Biff handed the pearl to his uncle. Charlie Keene inspected it carefully. "I'm no expert, Biff, but the color and particularly the shape of this pearl, I'd say you found a really valuable one." "How much? How much is it worth?" "I couldn't tell. Only an expert could. But it's a white pearl. They're the most valuable. And it's almost perfectly round. It could be worth several thousands of dollars." "Whoopee!" Biff shouted. "Let me at more of those oysters." Interest quickened. The four worked in silence, but they worked fast. Oyster after oyster was opened, carefully inspected, then tossed aside. Derek found the next one. It too was perfectly shaped, but slightly smaller than the one Biff had found. It was Crunch who came through with the topper. A big grin on his face, Crunch came over to Biff and held out his huge hand. In the center of his palm was a pearl twice the size of those already found. "This is it! This is it! Look at Crunch's pearl!" Again they all crowded around. This was a real beauty. It didn't take an expert to know that Crunch had found a pearl of great value. "Think we've found it, Uncle Charlie?" Biff asked. "I mean the fishery Derek's father discovered." "It could be, Biff. It darn well could be." Biff looked at Derek. There was a smile on the Dutch boy's face. Then the smile disappeared. "What's the matter, Derek?" Biff asked. "My father found black pearls," Derek replied. "They're all colors, Derek," Uncle Charlie told him. "Actually, the black ones aren't as valuable as the white. They're valuable, all right, especially if they're perfectly matched, as those two your father sent us were. I'd feel a lot more certain that we'd found the right place if we found some black ones." "Let's go back down when we finish these oysters," Biff said. "With all those sharks?" "Funny thing about sharks," Uncle Charlie said. "Although they are the pearl diver's greatest enemy, they can also help produce the pearl." "How?" Biff wanted to know. "The best pearl is the perfectly round pearl. The foreign body which gets into the oyster must be perfectly round to produce the perfect pearl. These round objects are the eggs of parasitic worms. The adult worms are the parasites of sharks." "So where you find sharks, you can find pearls?" Biff asked. "Not exactly, Biff. What I mean is this. Where there are pearl fisheries, the perfect pearls come from the eggs the sharks' parasites lay." No more pearls were found in the batch dug that morning. It was growing late in the afternoon. They decided to go back to the morning site, and if no sharks were in evidence, they'd try half an hour's diving. They returned to the same site. Biff and Derek went overside. Before they started scooping up oysters, they made sure no sharks were around. Biff loaded one basket and sent it up. He saw Derek send one up. Biff filled another. He looked at his watch. They'd been down 20 minutes. "One more basket," Biff said to himself, "and we'll call it a day." He turned in Derek's direction to signal to him that this was the last basket. Roiling water ahead pushed an alarm button in Biff's mind. He increased his speed. Derek was being attacked savagely by giant band shells. They swarmed around him, slashing at him with their claw-shaped, horny shells. Biff whipped out his knife and shot into action. The giant band shells, many times the size of the ordinary conch shell, are the only known shellfish to attack human beings. They have a tough, scimitar-shaped muscle which they use as a door to close the opening at the large end of the shell. While other conches use this muscle only as a door, the giant band shell uses it as a weapon. The end of the muscle is hooked and razor-sharp. The giant band shell springs at a man, using a second muscle to propel itself, then slashes and cuts with its door. In moments it can cut a man's body to shreds. These giants were surrounding Derek. Up close, Biff could see Derek had already received several cuts. Biff knew what this meant. Sharks would come racing through the water, crazed with hunger by the smell of blood. Biff slashed away at the band shells with his knife. It did no good. The giant shells continued their attack, some of them turning on Biff. There was only one thing to do. Derek was nearly helpless. Biff grabbed him. He shoved him upward with all his strength. Derek disappeared above him. Now the band shells turned their full attack on Biff. He fought them off, trying at the same time to rise. Several of them tried to fasten onto Biff's legs. He kicked out desperately. He thrust down with his open hands and shot upward. The slower-moving band shells were left behind. Biff reached the surface. He lost no time in scrambling into the boat. Uncle Charlie already had pulled Derek, bleeding, into the boat. Biff just made it. No sooner was he in the boat than the waters around it boiled with the maddened sharks searching for the source of the blood. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25, A Double Find. Derek's cuts from the giant band shells were many, but not deep ones. Biff and his uncle cleaned the cuts, treated them with a disinfectant and put Derek to bed. The Dutch boy was not seriously wounded, but he was suffering from shock. The thing to do, Biff knew, was to keep him warm and quiet. Charlie Keene gave Derek half a sleeping tablet, and the boy finally dozed off. "What a day! 2 narrow escapes. We should never have gone back," Charles Keene said. "You didn't tell me there were clam and conch shells in that bed." "Didn't know they were dangerous," Biff replied. "And just to see if we could find some black pearls," his uncle commented. "Let's open the oysters we dug," Biff suggested. "Derek seems to be all right." An hour later, Biff came back to the tent. Derek stirred restlessly in his sleep. Biff lighted a lamp. Derek suddenly sat upright. Biff went to his side. "You all right, Derek?" Biff asked. I guess so. I was dreaming, but, Derek touched a bandaged cut gingerly. "Sure, I'm all right." "This may make you feel even better." Biff held out his hand. He thrust it under Derek's eyes. The hand held a black pearl. The next morning, convinced that they had located Bromzook's fabulous pearl fishery, camp was broken. Gear was stored in the cabin cruiser. The tent was struck. By noon, the 4 pearl searchers were back in La Trinité. The party's happiness was mingled with sadness. One adventure was over. Derek's father's claim was safe. The quest had been successful, but Bromzook, Derek's father, was still missing. "I can't ask you to stay with me any longer," Derek said. "You've done more than enough for me." "I'll stick with you as long as you want me to, Derek," Charles Keene said. "That goes for me too, Derek," Biff added, hoping his uncle would not mention school. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to stay on in Martinique for a while. I'm going to every town and village on the island until I make as certain as possible my father isn't here." Then, Derek stopped. Biff knew what his friend was thinking. He knew that Derek would then have to come to the conclusion that his father had been lost at sea. "What about you, Crunch? Where are you going?" "Crunch go back up mountains, stay with little brother for a while." "You found him? You didn't tell us that," Biff exclaimed. "Too busy finding pearls. Crunch no want to bother you." "Well, we said we'd try to clear your brother. We still mean to do so, don't we, Uncle Charlie?" "We certainly do, Crunch." "You come with Crunch to talk to little brother?" "You bet, Crunch," Biff replied. "Maybe Crunch can help Derek too," the Indian said. "How? What do you mean?" Biff demanded. "Crunch may help Derek find father." Derek touched the Indian on the arm. "Anything you do will help, Crunch, but have you any clue?" "Crunch not sure. Hear about white man up in mountain called Kabe." Derek grabbed the Indian by both shoulders and shook him. Tell me about the white man," he urged. "Little brother tell story. Little brother live in mountains in small shack. Tell about sick white man. White man come to mountains 2 months, maybe 3 months, maybe more, long time ago. Get very sick. Priest take white man in. Maybe your father." "Can we go there right now?" Derek asked excitedly. "Take long time, hard trip up mountains." They started out late that afternoon. Night overtook the party before their journey was half completed. Exhausted by the hard day and the excitement of Crunch's clue, the first real one Derek had, all 4 slept in the open. By mid-morning the next day they reached the shack where Crunch's brother, Moti, lived. Moti told the same story Crunch had told the day before. "Is this place far from here?" Derek asked eagerly. 1 hour away," Moti replied. From Moti's description of the place, Uncle Charlie came to the conclusion it was a small monastery. Moti led them to it. A bearded monk took them inside. Derek babbled out the story of his search. The monk bowed his head. "Please wait," he said. The monk went down a long, narrow passage. He turned a corner and was out of sight. Derek's heart was throbbing. Biff and his uncle were tense with hope. Minutes passed. The shuffling of feet were heard. The monk was halfway back to the waiting group when another figure came into the passage. He was tall, gaunt, wasted by illness. But there was a smile of happiness on his face. Derek Zook raced down the passageways to meet his father. Biff, his uncle Derek, and his father were sitting in the patio of the Sans Souci. Hummingbirds darted in and out of the bougainvillea which poured over the terrace. It was the afternoon of the day after Bromzook had been found. Bromzook's story was short. On the day he had mailed the letters and pearls to his son and to Charles Keene, he discovered he was being followed. He had thought it best to disappear into the hills until his claim could be filed and acted upon. In the hills he had become ill of a tropical fever. He had been found by a monk and carried to the monastery. There he had lain close to death for weeks, not knowing what was going on about him. Only in the last 2 weeks had he come back to his senses. The monks had insisted that he stay with them until he was strong enough to travel. "Well, I guess that about winds up my stay here in the Caribbean," Biff said. "I've got to get back to good old Indianapolis and school." "We'll hate to see you go, Biff," Derek said. "Won't you come back and visit us?" "Or maybe you could come to Indianapolis," Biff invited. "I'd like to," Derek said eagerly. "One more piece of business," Uncle Charlie cut in. "What's that, Keene?" Bromzook asked. "I'd like to make sure that we found the same pearl fishery you discovered." "Good idea." Bromzook glanced at his watch. "I'm anxious to get back to Curatio. Why don't you get everything ready and the boys and I will take a run down the coast in the boat. They can show me their spot." "Good. You ought to be back in a couple of hours. I'll find Crunch and he can help me," Charlie said. "What about Crunch, Uncle Charlie? Is he going back with us?" "No, Biff. He's going to stay here until I send back word about his brother. I talked to Moti. I feel sure we can straighten things out in Curatio." "Tell Crunch and Moti they can count on that," Bromzook said. The run down the coast was a pleasant one. Biff steered the cruiser over the spot where they had located the pearls. "Does this look like the place, sir?" Biff asked. Bromzook took a sight on an island to the cruiser's port side. "This is it all right, and there should be thousands of dollars worth of pearls beneath us." As Biff, Derek and his father were approaching the harbour in Baie de Tresor, they saw Dietz and Specs in their boat, heading in the direction of the pearl fishery. "Won't do them any good now," Bromzook said. "The injunction he obtained has been cancelled." They watched the boat until it was nearly out of sight. "Look!" Derek shouted excitedly. Bromzook and Biff looked in the direction Derek was pointing. They saw the ugly, menacing clouds, forerunners of a chubasco. "It'll strike in a few moments," Bromzook said. "And right at the spot we last saw Dietz," Biff shouted. "The winds were already getting heavier in the harbour." "We can do nothing to help them. We're too far away," Derek's father said soberly. The chubasco struck. Dietz's boat was right in the centre of its fury. There was little chance that he and Specs would escape the storm's vengeance. End of chapter 25, read by Peter Thomlinson. End of Mystery of the Caribbean Pearls by Andy Adams.